Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth lecture in our course series, The Stars of Paris. Hard to believe that we're already at the midpoint. We first, of course, would like to thank Wilmington Trust, who is generously sponsoring this course and all of our spring courses. And of course, we encourage you to go check out the Toulouse-Lautrec and the Stars of Paris exhibition. Today's lecture, Sex Workers in the City of Light, will be presented by Paul Morrison, Professor of English and Film Studies at Brandeis University. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Paul Morrison.
Thank you very much. You can hear me, I hope? Yes. Good. Let me begin by thanking the MFA. One of the great delights of living in Boston is access to this magnificent institution, and it's a great pleasure and indeed an honor to speak here. I've been happily a member of the MFA for many years, and it is just wonderful to be able to make a very small contribution to the wonderful programs this institution gives us. Okay. I hope you'll be patient with me. I'm going to start rather circuitously. I'm going to start in England, not France. I'm going to start with literature, not visual arts. And I'm going to start with marriage, not prostitution. I assume most of you are here for prostitution. And I trust a lot of you will recognize the famous line I'm about to quote. It is a truth universally acknowledged. You already know, don't you? What is it? It's Jane Austen. It's the first line of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. Now that's a perfect sentence. I could die happily if I had written it. It's perfectly composed with all of the elegance and grace of Jane Austen. But I think it's a real question. Is it true? Does a man with a good fortune need a wife? He might want one. It might be pleasant, but he doesn't really need one. Men with money enjoy an extraordinary degree of power and autonomy in the 18th and 19th century. And it's simply not true that men with good fortune need wives. What is true is directly the opposite. And I think it's part of Jane Austen's great irony that the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice really should be turned on its head. It is a truth universally unacknowledged that a woman not in possession of a good fortune must be in need of a husband. That is the great logic of Jane Austen's world. But it's a logic that can never be spoken. It can never be articulated. It can never be acknowledged. Women must marry for money. A. B. Women can't marry for money. That's the impossible paradox that women in Jane Austen have to negotiate. Not men, only women. What makes Jane Austen's world, I think, so fascinating is that the rules of the game, the rules of the marriage market, can never be articulated. They can never be acknowledged for what they are, because the moment you articulate them, you are breaking the rules. You're vulgar. you've made a fatal mistake, and that can have devastating repercussions for women. Okay? This is all predicated, I think, on the emergence of new forms of sexual and social relations between women and men in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And I'm going to read now the first passage on your handout, which is actually from Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto. Do you all have one if you want it? Okay. The bourgeoisie, whenever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motely feudal ties that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal wealth into exchange value. Now, in isolation, that passage is perhaps a little difficult to understand. But here, Marx is talking about what he sees as revolutionary in the ascendance, which really happens in the 19th century, of the middle class. It demystifies social relations, according to Marx. It exposes the hitherto unacknowledged or hidden fact that at the basis of everything is money, is cash. So we forget that Marx sees the bourgeoisie as at least initially revolutionary, and primarily because, again, it demystifies. It exposes the economic logic of relations that prior to the bourgeois ascendance were thought to be spiritual, religious, or whatever. Okay? So if the 19th century is the great age of demystification, of the open acknowledgement of the cash nexus, there are two exceptions to that, I think. One is marriage and love. Prior to the 18th and 19th century, to quote the great Tina Turner, love had nothing to do with it, or what's love got to do with it? Marriage was not a relationship between equal subjects who were pursuing their own psychological and sexual fulfillment. Marriage was an economic arrangement, a system of alliances between families in which fathers simply distributed their daughters in marriage for economic reasons. So here we have a bit of a paradox, that although Marx says it's the bourgeoisie that demystifies, that exposes the cash basis of everything, it's actually quite the opposite when it comes to marriage. The 19th century sees the ascendance of what historians of sexuality and social relations tend to call the companionate marriage. The first time historically, men and women are thought to be companions, not exactly equal, but not overtly hierarchical, where love was not seen and marriage was not seen as a means of perpetuating the status quo. So you have the emergence of this companionate marriage, which for the first time historically separates sex and desire and heterosexual companionship from money, which is one of the reasons why in the 19th century and even today. Prostitution, which openly acknowledges the connection between sex and money, desire and money, tends to be hidden in the shadows. Interestingly, the word prostitution means etymologically, in terms of where the word comes from, to make something public, to put it on display. But when you get to the 19th century, at least in England, prostitution becomes hidden, something in the shadows, because it questions the logic of the age. It questions the sense that for the first time historically, desire and love is separated from economics. And there is a second exception to this bourgeois demystification, and that's art. In the 19th century, you have the development of what's called aesthetic autonomy. The notion that art somehow miraculously rises above getting and spending, that it is not a capitalist enterprise, that it belongs to a spiritual or religious tradition that is exempt from the cash nexus. So what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that the French do it differently. Unsurprisingly, if you've been to France. And I would argue, anyway, they do it better. The French acknowledge the connection between art and money. The French acknowledge the connection between between desire and money, between sex and money, between marriage and prostitution. The stars of Paris in the 19th century were sex workers, largely. Long before the sex tape, or long before Kim Kardashian or Paris Hilton, the great women of France were known for their sexual prowess. And it was artists like Lautrec who made them stars. Okay? So just to reiterate, what we're going to explore today, I hope, is the notion that prostitution in France, in Paris in particular, expresses the usually unacknowledged logic of the age. And it brings both art and sex and love and desire into its orbit. Okay? With that in mind, I would like to turn to this, which is actually a photograph taken from an 1883 book called The Pretty Women of Paris, which was really the pornographic precursor to Paris on $20 a day. I tell you how old I am when $20 a day. It's been a long time since it's been $20 a day. In other words, this was a guide largely for English gentlemen that simply gave the names, the addresses, the sexual proclivities, and the accomplishments of working women. This woman, Leontine Messin, had sex with, among other people, the Prince of Wales, who later became Edward VII. He, in fact, had a special chair built for him in one of the brothels which could A, accommodate his weight, which was considerable, and his rather kinky sexual habits, which were equally considerable. But the sense of openness, of availability, of prostitution not hiding in the shadows is, I think, perfectly obvious in publications like this. Paris as a city of light is really a 19th century invention, when the city was radically transformed. The grand, beautiful boulevards, the open spaces, the glorious architecture. There was a massive urbanization and a massive influx of women to Paris from the provinces. Many of them ended up as prostitutes. In the actual pamphlet, The Pretty Women of Paris, Leontine is described as, let me just find, I want to get it exactly right. Here it is. Short, plump, and chubby with lovely blue eyes. Those were all compliments. Short, chubby, and plump. You can see historically how standards of female beauty have changed. Here is yet another of the pretty women of Paris. And beside her, the following was written: "For money, she will do all you may ask her." It's an interesting sentence, isn't it? It's elegant, it's straightforward, it's unembarrassed, it's unjudgmental. And it is, in some sense, an expression of the logic of the age, which in London would never be acknowledged, but which in Paris was openly embraced. For money, she will do anything you ask her to. No shame, no guilt, a statement of economic fact. Certainly a statement of the exploitation of women, but that was in no way unique to prostitution. It's important to note that prostitution was in fact legal in France all throughout the 19th century. When Napoleon was crowned emperor in 1804, he insisted that brothels be registered and that women, working women, be regularly inspected, medical inspection. By about 1805, there were close to 200 official brothels in Paris. Women who worked the streets, which was the lowest form of prostitution. If they were caught working the streets more than twice, they were either arrested or forced to register as prostitute and ply their trades in what were known as houses of toleration. It'd be nice to have more houses of toleration, not necessarily sexual toleration, but toleration as a social good. And in fact, prostitution in France remained legal until 2016, at which point what was, to the French credit, what was criminalized was the activity of Johns, not sex workers. In other words, it's still legal to sell sex in Paris, you just can't buy it. Which, plays havoc with supply and demand, I guess. With that in mind, I want to turn to Baudelaire's great definition of art, which is the third quotation on the handout, which of course you can't read in this light, which says, Baudelaire was the great 19th century French poet, the author of, among other things, Flowers of Evil. And he says, "What is art? Question mark. Answer, prostitution." That interestingly, in 19th century Paris, prostitution, sex workers, was not only a privileged subject matter of art, but art itself was seen as a kind of form of prostitution, something caught up in capitalism, a money-making commodity, and not simply a spiritual good or goal, okay? With that in mind, I'd like to take a look at one of the great, great paintings of the 19th century. I'm sure many of you recognize this. It's in the Cortot in London, which is, it really should be in Paris, in my opinion, but it's Manet's Bar at the Follies Berger. It was painted late in Manet's life. It was shown at the Salon of 1882. Manet died the next year. And it's one of the most enigmatic and interesting paintings of the 19th century. One thing that you might not register with you as shocking is that this is a woman serving drinks. That's new to the Belle Epoque, to the late 19th century in Paris. Before men were servers, for the first time you get the sexualization of the restaurant, bar, and cabaret industry. And I think the fascinating question here is, what is for sale? What can you buy? Clearly, you can buy drinks, which you'd expect at the Folies Bergère, wouldn't you? But what else is this great painting suggesting you might be able to buy? What do you notice about the second bottle? I'm not here if that's for me. What do you notice about this bottle? Any beer drinkers? Anyone know what that is? What? Bass ale. Good, good. It's not French, it's English, interestingly. So you have that red triangle. Whoops, sorry. Titillating, that's to keep you interested. Do you see a red triangle anywhere else? Where? Yeah. Her flowers, the posy, forms a red triangle. Which does what? Which suggests that the commodity being sold, the booze, is indistinguishable from, or at least analogous to, the commodity that is the woman. That again, the painting, this great painting, is showing the logic of the cash nexus, where even women are commodities to be bought and sold. Whoops. Do you notice anything about this bottle? I don't know if you can read it. It's signed by Monet. That's his signature on the bottom of the bottle. What does that suggest? If the woman as commodity, as prostitute, and women who worked at the Folies Bergère had a reputation as being prostitutes, is associated with the commodity that's being sold, the drink, why does Monet decide to sign his painting on a bottle, which is also a commodity? Again, I think to emphasize Baudelaire's insight that in some sense, the art object itself has become a commodity on the art market. And this is going to be so important, particularly for Lautrec. This is an easel painting of the Folies Bergère. Lautrec is going to give us lithographs of the Folies Bergère, which are explicitly posters for the Folies Bergère. In other words, are you following? In other words, Lautrec's art is perilously close to advertising, to capitalism, to the promotion of goods. It's brilliant, but it doesn't deny its implication in the market economy. He works in lithographs. Again, lithographs are widely disseminable. You can disseminate them widely. They are goods that can be reproduced. In other words, Lautrec is at the forefront of a distinctly modern economy of art, which not only is interested in prostitution on the level of content, but also sees art itself as somehow a kind or form of prostitution. Lautrec, in my opinion, totally anticipates Andy Warhol, not only in making stars of New York or stars of Paris, but also in the open embrace and unembarrassed acknowledgement of the commercial dimension of his enterprise. There's something else. Whoops, again, sorry. You did come here for prostitution. There's something else remarkable about this painting, which I'm afraid I just love. I mean, I have to stop talking about it in a few moments or it'll be the whole bloody talk. But I want to try to explore that in relation to the quotation from John Berger, which is also on your handout. He just died recently, a very great art historian. In the average European oil painting of the nude, the principal protagonist is never painted. Fascinating observation. He, the principal protagonist, is the spectator in front of the picture, and he is presumed to be a man. Everything is addressed to him. Everything must appear to be the result of his being there. It is for him that the figures have assumed their nudity. Now, she is clearly not nude, but she is looking forward, looking out at the spectator. And Berger is arguing that in Western art, in the patriarchal sexist tradition that it often embodies, The real protagonist is the male spectator who gets symbolically to own and possess the woman. She is possessed in image, if not in body. And Berger says that protagonist, the real center of the painting, is never represented or is not represented. What is unusual about this painting? What is so disturbing about it spatially? Who is he? Top right. Where is he? It seems to be that he is standing in front of her. Here, where Berger says the typical male spectator, the typical male gaze is, and he's being reflected in the mirror behind. So, if that guy is a John, if he is interested in consuming or purchasing not only alcohol, but the woman, he also seems to be a surrogate for us. The notion that the violence of prostitution, the objectification or exploitation of women represented on the level of content, is potentially being repeated on the level of form. That again, everything is directed toward the male spectator who gets to capture her image. It's very hard to work out the spatial arrangements of this painting, where exactly he would have to be reflected that way, and how her back gets reflected. But the painting seems to want to do everything possible to discombobulate the viewer. What do you see up in the top left-hand corner? Pair of legs. What the hell are they? What are you doing with legs at the top of the painting? This is the Follies Berger. It's someone on a trapeze, right? But clearly the painting is trying to destabilize spatial relations and trying to make us, as the subject who is viewing the painting, somehow complicit in what is happening to this woman. Okay. Now, as Berger says, usually paintings don't want us to feel complicit, don't want us to be aware of our status as viewers. Whoops. Okay, not quite as good as Titian's Venus, but titillating still. This is Bellini's Young Woman at Her Toilette. Bellini is the teacher of Giorgione and Titian. He really initiates the Venetian school of painting. And this is a very traditional position for a woman in classical Western painting, particularly Renaissance painting. She is doing what? She is looking at herself in a mirror. In this case, in two mirrors. There's a mirror behind her and a mirror in front of her. And you might want to ask yourselves, why is Western art obsessed with women looking at themselves in mirrors or in pools or in anything that reflects their faces or their bodies. Berger argues that it is a way for the spectator, for the male spectator, not having to cop to what he's doing. This belongs to what we call the vanitas tradition, vanity. So what do? You look at this young woman and you condemn her for her vanity. You have a proper moral relationship to the vanity that is women, right? Bad, 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 bad. All the time, what are you doing? You get to look at a beautiful, naked woman without having to acknowledge the real source of your interest. Berger argues that this obsession with women looking at themselves is really a kind of alibi that allows us to look at them in good conscience. Compare that to Lautrec's wonderful woman before a mirror. In one sense, this is a highly conventional painting in that images of women before mirrors are ubiquitous in Western art. But what's unusual about it? Good. Her back is to us. The painting is not arranged for the view of a spectator who stands before it. It's not like the bar at the Folies Berger, Manet's great painting. Here, the woman seems to literally and metaphorically turn her back on the male gaze. It's not structured, although she is a prostitute. It is not structured by being looked at by men. In some sense, it seems to be a painting about self-commodification. She seems to be looking in the mirror, and I speculate that she is, in a certain sense, assessing her attractiveness, right? Her longevity as a prostitute. But what seems to me interesting and important about this painting is that if it is self-objectifying, that self-objectification isn't exacerbated by the painting itself. The painting does not make her an object of erotic fixation. She seems sad, she seems haunted, she seems in possession of a personality and a subjectivity, but this is not a, I think, fetishization or objectification of the prostitute. This is, of course, Manet's Olympia, probably the most scandalous painting of the 19th century, for reasons that I think are interesting and complex. And I'd like to discuss this painting in relation to the quotation from Laura Mulvey, which is on the handout. Laura Mulvey is a theoretician of gender and film not gender and easel painting or the traditional visual arts. But I think she has important things to say about women in Scopic economies in general. And this is the passage. In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact. So, and this is the most famous line from her essay, so that they can be said to connote to be looked at-ness. For Mulvey, the essence of women in patriarchal visual culture is that they connote to be looked at-ness, that their essence is visual objectification. But what was, I think, so shocking and revolutionary about this particular painting was she looks back. She stares openly and directly at the male spectator. Notice how, although there are two figures in this painting, and that the painting has complex racial as well as sexual connotations, everything is directed outward toward the presence of the spectator or the viewer. There is no man in the painting, but Berger would argue that everything is nevertheless structured by the male gaze. But here you have, I think, a woman, and there are lots of visual signs in this painting that she is a prostitute. The flower in her hair, her name, Olympia, the slipper that is half dangling from her foot, the rich blanket on which she is sitting, the bouquet of flowers probably from her lover. All of these were culturally legible signs that Olympia was a prostitute, although the woman who posed for it was not. She was actually a distinguished painter in her own right. And the black woman who is her servant here was in fact a model. So if women connote to be looked at-ness, it seems to me this revolutionary painting suggests that women connote to be looked back at-ness. That one is forced to be aware of what one is doing. This painting is based, and here finally we're getting to Titian, so those of you who have been waiting for it, here it comes. Whoops, wrong. There we are. Manet's painting is obviously alludes to and reconfigures Titian's Venus of Urbino, which in fact itself is a transformation of Giorgione's Dresden Venus. And it's interesting to note both the similarities and differences between the two paintings. Look at the expression on Titian's Venus. Look at the expression on Olympia. What's the difference between the two? Titian is all come hither flirtatiousness. She is looking out at the spectator, but not with that aggressive stare of Manet's Olympia. Her skin is luminous. You want to touch it. It seems to just be irradiated with light and sensuality. Olympia's is a flat, unnuanced block of color, or colorlessness, not unlike a Lautrec lithograph. Notice how Olympia is holding her left hand. You have to pay more money, it seems to be saying, if you want to see that. Look how Venus is holding her hand. It's not blocking anything. It's interesting that although we don't know for sure who the model was for Titian's Venus of Urbino, in all probability, she was a prostitute. And the painting later became known as the Venus of Urbino. Why? Well, because when you call the painting Venus, goddess of love, you have an excuse for her nudity. You have a high art, high culture, Greco-Roman explanation for why she is nude. There is absolutely no mythological paraphernalia in the painting that identifies her as Venus. Those of you who know your Renaissance iconography, who know, for example, Botticelli's great Venus in London, will know that Venus is associated with certain mythological apparatus and paraphernalia. There is none of that in this painting. It seems to me manifestly clear that this is not Venus, right? This is a prostitute. But in order for it to be, as it were, accepted as great art, it had to have this alibi. Whereas, interestingly, Manet's painting, in which the model is a famous, distinguished female painter, she is openly acknowledged as a prostitute. Here we have one of Lautrec's great pastels called the Medical Inspection. And here we have another even greater one called Rue des Moulins, of two sex workers standing in line waiting for their medical inspection. What do you notice about these two pastel drawings that are, I think, almost unique in terms of the visual history of the representation of prostitutes? What are they wearing? Shifts, or I don't know what you would call them. Where are the stockings and the garter belts? Where are the bustiers? Where is all the glamour of the stars of Paris? These are working women deglamorized, decommodified. What else do you notice about, sorry, I keep doing it the wrong way, these two pastel drawings? There are no men in them. The drawings aren't structured by the male gaze. Either a man within the frame of the drawing or the implied man who is the inspector. Interestingly, this is almost female prostitution seen without men, not structured by the gaze of a man. Lautrec was himself an aristocrat. I think he was actually the son of an earl. The fact his physical challenges, his physical deformities were largely the product of his parents were too closely related. They were first cousins. But when Lautrec moved to Paris and moved to Montmartre, he totally assimilated to the Bohemian culture and the world of prostitution. He, in fact, lived in a brothel for almost 2 years. He loved giving his address as a brothel. He loved shocking people with his address. And Lautrec saw himself as, because of his physical challenges, as someone who lived on the margins of society. He saw himself, and evidently the women with whom he lived and partied and talked and enjoyed himself saw him in the same way. So many of the portraits, pictures, representations of sex workers we've seen today in the 19th century have all been structured for male delight. All the way from the pretty women of Paris to the consumer of liquor and perhaps women and perhaps art in Manet's Follies Berger. Lautrec seems to me virtually unique in the history of the representation of sex workers in the sense of being, as it were, one with them. So what I would ultimately argue about Lautrec is that his art doesn't exacerbate the commodification. These are women who are clearly sad, who are clearly exploited. There is something haunting and perhaps even defeated about them. But at the same time, there are women of dignity, of individuality, and a kind of quietly heroic resilience. Take a look again at Rue des Moulins. The women here are lining up for their medical inspection, which was required by law almost fortnightly. And of course, the inspection was not in the interest of the women. They could care less about the women's health. They just didn't want them making the men sick. And here these women are offering up their bodies to the male gaze, which is at once police. It was run by the police. If women were found to be sick and incurable, they were imprisoned. So it's the male gaze with the force of the police, with the force of the medical establishment, with the force of the government. All these forms of power cohere and are inspecting the female body in terms of its use value for male consumption. It's hard to imagine a more devastating moment to be caught in or captured. But it seems to me Lautrec's great achievement is that he makes these women dignified and heroic. There is no sentimentality in Lautrec, particularly when it comes to prostitution. Those of you who know, for example, your 19th century French literature, or for that matter, your opera, La Traviata, for example, will know that one form in which the prostitute is always acceptable is the cliche of the prostitute with a heart of gold, right? The woman who sells herself only to discover true love and realizes that true love transcends money, right? And transcends commodification. Lautrec is at the farthest remove from that sentimentality, which imposes a kind of narrative or identity on the women. Lautrec accepts the dignity of their profession, is not blind to its exploitations and its hardships, but nevertheless celebrates its quiet heroism. I think I will end there and see if there are any comments or questions. Thank you very much. Please. Oh, I don't know if everyone could hear that, but there was a very interesting observation. So that's very interesting. I must say I've never noticed this before. This woman pointed out that the gentleman who is reflected in the mirror, the man who seems to be in the spatial logic of the painting standing in front of her and being reflected in the mirror, actually has a mustache or semi-beard that is recalls and echoes the shape of the pansies on the woman's breasts and the triangle on which unites the three, interestingly, in this commodification. Thank you. That's a very good observation. Please.
Hold on, we have microphones.
Oh, we have microphones coming. Thank you.
Where is the question?
Okay.
I have two questions. One, what happened to the children born into brothels? And second, you didn't touch on male prostitution. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Okay, what happened to the children born into brothel, and what about male prostitution? I'll start with the second first. The Pretty Women of Paris had actually a selection for lesbian sexual tourism, as it were, largely associated with famous Parisian actresses and dinner parties. So it was available to women. Male prostitution was not legal, although it was available. And there is at least one fairly famous male brothel, of which there are even pictures that exist today of men having sex. So it was less ubiquitous then. And you have to remember, we're at a time now in the 19th century when the term homosexuality is first being coined. So many One thing that's very hard for the modern mind to wrap, it's very difficult for us to think of sex in pre-modern terms, but the notion that you have sex with someone is a distinctly modern notion. In the pre-modern world, sex was something you did to someone. The notion that sex is the expression of affection and mutual esteem and love is a distinctly modern notion. In the classical world, for example, male-to-male sex was accepted as long as the partners were socially differentiated. In other words, if you were a Greek citizen and you were the active partner in anal sex with another man, that was fine. But you couldn't be the passive partner. And what you find with 19th century prostitution is that, and I didn't quote it, but there's a passage on your handout from Freud, which talks about the difficulty of desiring where you love and loving where you desire. And it was commonly thought that you needed prostitution so you didn't have to ask your wife to do disgusting things. In other words, the sex acts, and this is apparently true even to this day, that the sex acts required or asked for with prostitutes tend to be different from what sex one has with a partner one loves. So there was there was also a hierarchy of brothels. Courtesans were the very highest. They were the stars of Paris. They ended up being incredibly wealthy women who had sex with royalty, aristocrats, had their own private homes, et cetera, et cetera. Then there were prostitutes who worked in houses of toleration. And then there were the lowest, the streetwalkers. So that hierarchy tended to be racially specific. It tended to be province versus et cetera, et cetera. So it's infinitely complex. Children born in, there's not a great deal of records of that. There was, however, a thriving kind of orphanage system in France where unmarried women who had children could discreetly have the child and could continue to support him or her for a long time. There were, of course, illegal, backroom, dangerous abortions, too. There was a sense, if I'm not sentimentalizing here, which I hope I'm not, but you do read occasionally of the kind of comradeship of the brothel, where occasionally children are kind of accepted as common property that everyone raises, but whether or not they're actually, whose child it was is problematic.
I have a question about the age of the women, especially in the book that you started with. You may have mentioned this, I didn't get it. In that last painting of the examination, it's clear that there's an older woman and a younger woman, but I wondered if you could say anything about the age distribution.
Yes, good question. One of the things that made Manet's Olympia so scandalous, and I probably should have pointed this out as we went back and forth between Titian's Venus and Manet's Olympia, is how much younger Olympia seems to be. Her body is girlish. It's not the voluptuous, womanly body of Titian's. So part of the scandal of Manet's was also her lack of development, which they saw. She wasn't middle-aged, and she wasn't plump. Baudelaire, for example, thought that nudity with thin women was more obscene than nudity with plump women. Again, the change in standards. Sex was valid, or sex was legal for young women. But interestingly, the great prostitutes weren't teenagers. The great courtesans were 20s, 30s, and they survived as working women long into what we would consider to be middle age. The cult of youth and the cult of thinness had not yet developed. I think.
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
I'm thinking of France still having a conservative Catholic religion context. And so I'm wondering, how is this all this activity playing out against that backdrop, the backdrop of what I assume was relatively powerful bishops and archbishops and the coding and all of that?
Yes, although if you, and I don't want to get onto dangerous ground here, but if you look at, the history of the Catholic Church and the papacy, for example, it's hardly been a model of celibacy. And so I think there is, interestingly, in France, a kind of worldly acceptance that this is inevitable. Like when Napoleon in 1804 required registration and medical inspections, the proclamation just said that you can't do anything about prostitution. It's always been there, it will ever be there. And they actually saw it as a kind of safety net for marriage. In England, and again, these are crude generalizations, and please take them with a grain of salt, but crudely put, in England, I think prostitution was seen as a challenge to marriage. That if you could buy it on the side, your primary emotional and sexual relationship was threatened. In France, it was seen really as a kind of necessary outlet. At least one of the women in The Pretty Women of Paris talks about her boyfriend and that he's not jealous. She saw it as perfectly compatible to have a love relation and nevertheless prostitute herself out. So I think there was a kind of pragmatic notion in France that it helps the status quo. It's regulated, it's safe, and therefore it's not going to be threatening.
How do you explain the difference between France and the other European countries and England? What do you think the roots of this different idea about marriage, love, sex?
Well, the big thing is the Napoleonic Code. In countries that Napoleon conquered, prostitution tended to be legalized, whereas in non-Napoleonic countries, it remained. Interestingly, prostitution, this goes to the woman's interesting question a moment ago. In Catholic countries, it tended to be more tolerated than Protestant countries. Now, it's not. I think we would be wrong to say, prostitution was ubiquitous in France and none heard of in France. One of the recommended readings on the handout is a wonderful book by a French theoretician named Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And the first chapter is called We Other Victorians. And it actually talks about just how much sex was going on under good old Queen Victoria and in England. One of the things we tell ourselves as modern people in a kind of self-congratulatory way that I think is totally unjustified is how much freer we are than they were. That our relationship to sex is brave and open, and whereas they were so repressed. But if you actually look at sex historically, that is simply not true. I think we need the microphone. Okay, please.
Do you have any comment on whether Manet and Lautrec were both making a similar social comment about the commodity of women, or were their views different?
Well, again, my sense, and I would emphasize it's my sense, and I would urge you to check it against other people's reading, is that Manet wants to force into recognition and representation the male gaze. In other words, this painting, in my opinion, tries to embody the logic of how women have been objectified by the male gaze by including within it a surrogate for the spectator. Whereas it seems to me what is radical about Lautrec, and I know this is a contradiction in terms, is that he represents prostitution as if there were no men, including himself. In other words, it's almost as if the male gaze is absent. You have the sense of, it's not Degas, it's not, the ballerinas resting behind the stage. It's something different. So I think they're doing something that is ideologically similar in that I find them both as kind of proto-feminist painters, but I think they do it from different perspectives and through different techniques. Please.
In order to be self-sufficient, it seems to me these women needed to be working continuously with few interruptions. So how did they handle or get access to birth control?
Lots of different ways. First of all, interestingly, commercial sex is not even in the majority penetrative vaginal sex. As I said a few moments ago, often sex workers are asked to perform sex acts that are not standard. For example, in Roman society, oral sex was only legal with slaves and prostitutes. So we can't assume that all the sex would issue in childbirth. And they took, the precautions that were available to them. Some of them did get pregnant and did have children. But again, it's a good question because it also, I think, challenges a narrative, a self-congratulatory narrative we tell ourselves, is that it wasn't just the pill and it wasn't just the 1960s that started the sexual revolution. And the notion that sex is vaginal and penetrative and nothing else is also a very modern invention. So there was lots of sex before the pill. Please.
Yeah. A while ago, the MFA showed a series of paintings by Degas in the brothels, and it seems to me that they were more pornographic in a way than what we see now.
Yes, good observation. What I think is interesting, and I should have made this more explicit, about the two we saw today, Lautrec's, they're not erotic in the slightest. Degas are pornographic. Lautrec did a series of lithographs called L of nothing but prostitutes, and it was one of the few times he wasn't commercially successful because there was nothing titillating about his prostitutes. They're not beautiful. They're not in sexy garbs. If they're pulling up their dresses, It's because they're having their genitals inspected. So Degas, I think, who is a magnificent artist, Degas, I think, is a far more conventional in his objectification and eroticization and commodification of the prostitute's body. I think he is, in that sense, a less revolutionary artist than Lautrec. But I think you're exactly right. It was a great show, wasn't it, the Degas show? I think you need the microphone. Do we? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I can't see people, so you have to tell me where.
I'm over here. What we're hearing about sex trafficking today is that women, particularly vulnerable women, are being lured, sometimes unsuspectingly, into the sex trade by quote-unquote boyfriends who become their pimps, and the women who run massage parlors. There was a big a show on that on TV last night that was particularly enlightening, since it involved my hometown, Salem, among others. And so I'm wondering if that was the case back then, because you didn't really mention things about madams or pimps. Were women freelancers, or were they lured in by dominating and abusive handlers?
Good question. By law, brothels had to be run by women, and they were usually former prostitutes themselves. But by law, there were no brothels run by men. So there was, again, this, we tend to think of prostitution as the oldest profession, but that's not really true. It only really becomes a profession in the 19th century. In other words, often pre-modern, women would prostitute themselves occasionally, under necessity, under hardship, et cetera, but often they did not identify themselves professionally as courtesans or prostitutes. In the 19th century, especially when it became illegal for women to walk the streets, if you were caught twice, again, you were forced into a house of toleration or you were imprisoned. It kind of issued in the professionalization of prostitution. So in some sense, it was regulated, and they weren't subject to the brutality of the streets. You know, they had a place to live, they had reasonable wages, et cetera, et cetera. There were, however, an awful lot of women. Again, 19th century was a great age of urbanization when everyone from the provinces came to Paris. And there's no doubt about it, women were exploited and forced into prostitution. There was also, of course, the glamorization of prostitution in a way that is almost unthinkable for us now. Again, the closest thing I think are the sex tapes of kind of minor non-celebrities like Kim Kardashian and please.
Yes, this is on. I'm glad you have that picture up, because I noticed two things.
This picture?
Yes.
Okay.
She seems to be staring into space, not looking at anybody. It's just an observation. And
yes, it's remarkably blank, isn't it?
The edge of the mirror, what you're seeing is this huge audience. And the edge of the mirror, to me, I'd almost think that's a balcony, and they're watching.
Yes.
I mean, they are watching a show, but
yes,
it's just an interesting backdrop.
Yes.
For this.
It's very, very difficult to work out rationally the spatial relations between and among things. But you're right, seems to be a balcony where there's a trapeze artist in it. And actually, if you know Manet's circle, those are all his friends in the back. He painted into it. But you can't, logically, the man, that makes no sense in terms of pure perspective and pure geometry. I think Manet is playing with perspective Oh, okay. Sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
You talk about the glamorization of prostitutes and kind of Lautrec's rejection of that glorification. And I'm wondering how prostitutes during that time might have actually felt about that, because I imagine the de-glamorization of their business didn't do so well for their business. Do we know at all about their opinions on Lautrec's work?
They loved Lautrec, and certainly Lautrec was such a successful, what we would now almost call graphic artist, who worked, the equivalent of working for an advertising firm, those magnificent posters, which are still the standard, I think, of posters for the Folies Berger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He seemed to be, he gave prostitutes gifts, he was close friends with them. He seemed to be, as it were, accepted as one of the girls. And there seemed to be a strong sense that his social marginalization as an alcoholic, as physically challenged, put them in some sort of empathetic relationship with him. He seemed, however, though, to move seamlessly between the stars of Paris. Remember that Lautrec comes from an aristocratic family, and the lower rungs of the sex trade. He seemed to be not caught in a particular class identity. Please, who has a mic?
I do. I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
No, over here.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So the 19th century pictures we've looked at, I feel like the women are sad and exploited. And I think, to me, that might disprove the idea that art is prostitution. I don't know who, at the time, might be interested in paying a lot of money for the two women being inspected, for example. I mean, that's just sad. Certainly the posters were all for sale, and he made a lot. But to put so much work into this picture and to those seems to me an act not of not a commercial endeavor.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I hope that I thought that is what I was saying. Maybe I haven't been very clear that I don't think Lautrec contributes to or continues the tradition of the commercialization or the commodification of prostitution. I think he avoids both the sentimentalization. Again, the 19th century loved the prostitute with the heart of gold, right? Think of La Traviata, think of Les Dames au Camille, et cetera, et cetera. He rejects that. And I didn't emphasize in this talk, which maybe I should have, his lithographs and portraits of the great stars of Paris. There was always a kind of fuzzy line between who was a prostitute, who was a dancer, who was a barmaid, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the dancers, for example, that Lautrec depicts with such exuberance and such beauty also turned tricks. But the pictures that I find the most haunting are the ones I showed today of what in my opinion is, again, a real dignity and a real respect for the work and the women.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have just one more question in the back.
Okay, sorry. Could you come after? We can talk. Okay, good.
Thank you very much. Would you just clarify your previous comment about the form and the content?
I'm sorry, I can't hear
Hi.
you.
Thank you very much. Would you just comment on your previous, or clarify your previous comment about the similarity of form and content of the painting?
This painting?
Yes.
Okay. The content seems to be about commercial transactions, right? What, as I think I asked, what is being sold here and what is being bought? In one sense, the obvious answer is alcohol, right? That is obviously the commodity that is for sale. And at the foreground of the painting, you also you have essentially still lives, don't you? The French would call them nature morte. So in one sense, the painting is about selling commodities. I tried to suggest that that commodity is both the woman as server and the commodities she is serving. That the reiteration of the shape of the posy and the shape on the bottle identifies her as yet another of the commodities you can buy at the Folies Berger. Then I try to suggest that, interestingly, when Manet signs his painting on a bottle, an obvious commodity, he is implicitly commenting on the fact that his painting, which is about things being bought and sold, will also be bought and sold. That the painting itself, as a painting, as a form, is reflecting on the content it represents. Is that any clearer? Is that helpful? Thank you.